It's been just over a month since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, but despite promising to unite the party, he's already facing 3 Tory rebellions. Now, 2 of them involve the new Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. It was due to have its third reading in Parliament this week, but it's been delayed after a Tory backbencher rebellion threatened to overturn the government's majority. So what are the issues at play? Well, the first involves targets for building new homes. In the 2019 Conservative manifesto, Boris Johnson pledged to build 300,000 new homes each year. That target is now at risk after around 50 backbench Tory MPs signed an amendment that would have forced the government to scrap mandatory house building targets for local authorities. Theresa Villiers is the author of the amendment. She appeared on Sky's Sophie Ridge on Sunday.
What's the idea for the amendment, first of all?
The amendment is to return local control over planning decisions to local communities. These targets, I think, are based on 2014 out-of-date population figures. They're disproportionately pushing for delivery in the crowded southeast. And to meet those targets in the southeast, there's a danger that we essentially risk making the same mistakes as the 60s and 70s with high-rise, high-density blocks, greenfield development, all of which would be damaging to our environment and the quality of life of many people.
The government's now set to pull the vote completely tomorrow. Do you see that as a victory?
I think it is an important victory, and I really welcome the government's decision on that because they were sending a clear signal that they wanted to look at these issues again, and the Secretary of State has subsequently been out on the airways saying he really understands our concerns and he wants to try and provide some reassurance. So I hope that does happen.
Villiers' constituency is Chipping Barnet in North London. It's a pretty well-off place. The number of children living in poverty is well below the national average, and the average house price is £602,000. So are these Tory MPs turning against younger people in need of homes in favour of their older, richer and NIMBY voters? That's a question Ridge put to Villiers.
I just want to read you a quote by Sajid Javid, who's written in today's Sunday Times. He says he's dismayed by your amendment, and he says it would put meaningful policy into reverse. We risk creating a generation that turns its back on the politicians who failed them, a generation that without any capital of its own becomes resentful of capitalism and capitalists. Has he got a point?
I disagree with Sajid's approach. I think future generations won't thank us if we destroy the environment in the cause of building new homes. We can deliver new homes. We can do it in a sustainable way with the consent of local communities. And I think the better way to do that is to remove these top-down targets and give more power, agency and responsibility to local communities.
So Villiers is claiming there that she wants to protect the environment for the next generation. Her voting record says something different, though. She's voted in favour of fracking and selling off England's forests and against almost all measures to reduce climate change. The second rebellion also concerns the environment and onshore wind farms this time. So during the Tory leadership campaign in the summer, Sunak pledged to keep a de facto ban on onshore wind farms in place. That was one of the 3 highlights he picked out from his energy strategy. That ban was brought in originally by David Cameron in 2010, and while Boris was in favour of overturning it, he bowed to pressure from MPs to keep it in place. When Liz Truss became Prime Minister, though, her disastrous mini-budget actually promised to allow new onshore wind farms to be built. Of course, she wasn't around long enough to see that through, but now the Times has reported this. At least 30 Tory MPs, including Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, now back an amendment to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill that would force the government to end the ban on new onshore wind farms. Yesterday, Labour announced that it would support the amendment, which is led by Simon Clarke, the former Levelling Up Secretary. Labour's backing means that only 5 more Conservative MPs would be needed to wipe out the government's majority. Other rebels are actually members of the cabinet, including, apparently, the Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove. If that's true, he'd be backing an amendment to his own bill. And now it looks like the Prime Minister might be forced to back down. Business Secretary Grant Shapps appeared on Sky News where he was confronted with this.
Simon Clarke, former Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove, who is now the Levelling Up Secretary, both forcing the government's hand on onshore wind, and Simon Clarke saying they're 5 MPs away from forcing the government to do what they want.
I don't recognise it in those terms at all. Simon Clarke it has put in an amendment, which I haven't studied all the ramifications of yet, but actually essentially saying exactly what I said to you, which is that local people ought to have a very, very keen say in this, which is indeed government policy. There are always different ways to skin a cat, as it were, but we'll have a close look at what's being proposed. But
sounds like the government might be backing down on this one.
No, exactly what we've said all along. In fact, Rishi Sunak said the other week, where onshore happens, it needs to happen with local
He said he was
agreement.
against it. He said he was against any further onshore wind. He said that to me during the summer.
I think you're being far too black and white about this. I've always said... Yeah,
I absolutely pressed him on it, and he said he was against it. He said he'd misspoken the day before, and he said he was against onshore wind.
So I've always said, and indeed he has always said, where onshore wind happens, it needs to happen with local consent.
Obviously, more onshore wind would mean better energy security for the UK, and it's popular with voters too. This YouGov poll from October shows that 77% of all voters and 73% of Conservative voters are in favour of new wind farms in their local areas. Only 17% of voters would oppose new onshore wind. It looks like Sunak is likely then to be forced into 2 U-turns in a single week, a fact that will please Boris Johnson and his supporters. In a separate article this weekend, The Times reported this. Johnson's challenge in particular represents the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. Until now, the former Prime Minister had been publicly supportive of Sunak, but allies say he will become more robust in his interventions in defending what he sees as his legacy issues, including levelling up. His supporters are convinced that Sunak will fall and that Johnson will replace him, with the May local election seen as a focal point. We're not going quietly, one backer of Johnson said. They won't be able to get any legislation through. Aaron, that idea that Rishi Sunak is going to fall and Boris Johnson is going to replace him seems a little bit far-fetched. But there is a very interesting, I think, factional struggle going on in the Conservative Party now. I think the Boris Johnson side is sort of trying to pose this as being the pro-growth and the anti-growth coalition. So the pro-growth Tories want onshore wind, they want to build new houses, they want planning reform, and the anti-growth Tories, what they are is essentially the representatives of British NIMBYs, so people who say not in my backyard to any development. They don't want housing targets, they don't want onshore wind. And this is now, we're sort of told, a new factional battle, dividing line within the Conservative Party. How significant do you think this could be for the rest of this Tory government?
It's a major problem, Michael, because look, it's a while back now, but do you remember the by-election Amersham and Chesham, which was entirely about NIMBYism? And yes, of course, there was a national backlash against Boris Johnson, but the Liberal Democrats came through on that because of planning applications with regards to infrastructure with housing and so on. People just simply did not want it there. Now, if you look at how the Tories have tried to build an electoral coalition since 2010, it has been clientelistic. It has been big business, older voters, hence the pension triple lock, and homeowners, particularly in its southeastern kind of heartlands, at least until 2019, when it had that breakthrough because of Brexit, really, and the so-called Red Wall. But before then, those heartlands were critical for them, the home counties. And I think this is one of those policy areas where it sounds nice to say, yeah, we want growth, we want to build more houses, we want to, build on the green belt. But actually, you've got 50, 60 Tory seats in play, which would always be a challenge for them. They would never really want to do that. But given the fact they're also looking at a spanking in the Red Wall from Labour, all the polling right now shows them losing dozens of seats up there too. It would be very strange and surprising for them to be perceived as letting down their base to such an extent. So yes, we need housing in this country. We particularly need housing in the southeast because, of course, that's where all the growth happens. It's not a good thing, but that's just how it is. And hence, that's where an overwhelming sort of majority, proportionally speaking, of housing demand is. It's in the southeast, not just in London, Greater London, places like Luton, Reading, bits of Kent. They're growing really quickly, and that's where we need those homes. And what I found really funny, Michael, is the way that Theresa Villiers talked about the whole thing. We don't want to be building over our countryside. Yes, we need homes, but we shouldn't be destroying nature. Her constituency is High Barnet, Michael. They have an H&M there. They have a Robert Dias on their high street. I've been there. The way she's talking about it makes it sound like the Outer Hebrides. Personally, I'm of a view that we should actually build as much density in seats exactly like hers, as much density as possible. Skyscrapers. Every single brownfield site in Chipping Barnet or High Barnet should be built upon. And then, yes, if we're serious about meeting climate targets and ecological restoration, we probably need to revive rainforests and marshes in places like Wales, in the Scottish Highlands, in the southwest of England, for instance, in the moors. So I find it a very strange calculation to say we need to preserve nature when you're talking about somewhere in Zone 4 London. She means a golf course. That isn't nature, Theresa.
No, I think that's so well put. I mean, there's just this bizarre obsession with saving fields. Like what I think we need in this country is very dense cities and then big areas of wilderness. Like they're two very functional land uses, right? So big dense cities, that's where we can all live. I like living in dense cities. I like being able to walk to see lots of my friends or to different interesting things. Then we also need, for a number of reasons, to rewild vast swathes of the country. But instead you've got this weird Tory coalition that just want everything to be a field. Everything has to be a field. The fields don't serve that much purpose, really. There's another rebellion brewing, and this one is being led by a cabinet member, Andrew Mitchell. He is the Minister for International Development. Under Boris Johnson, Britain's international aid budget was cut from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5%. That translated into a reduction of £4.6 billion. It was supposed to be a temporary measure to balance the books after the pandemic, but in his autumn statement, Jeremy Hunt kept it at the lower rate. Andrew Mitchell, though, wants the budget restored. He's given an interview to the Sunday Times where he said this: "When Labour left office in 2010, Britain was an acknowledged development superpower. When David Cameron was in government, we were definitely a development superpower. Today, let's be frank, we are not a development superpower and we need to win that back. It's impossible to deny that Britain's reputation during recent years internationally has declined. Short of installing myself in Jeremy Hunt's bedroom and lurking under his bed, I don't think I could have lobbied more trenchantly. Both Jeremy and I voted against the government's decision to cut the 0.7%, so I have always felt throughout these negotiations that he's on our side. But he has to cut the cake, so I accept what he has given us." Now, that interview hasn't gone down well with some Tories. In a Tory WhatsApp group chat leaked to Politico, Tory MP Mark Jenkinson said, This certainly pushes the boundaries of collective responsibility. Crikey! The more I read it, the worse it gets. I've written articles deliberately critical of the government that are more supportive. I can only assume it wasn't meant to be helpful. I suggest the PM doesn't read it over breakfast."
I know this seems like a small policy area, and it is. We're talking about development aid as a percentage of GDP. It used to be 0.7%, now it's significantly lower. I think it was called DFID. It's no longer called DFID, isn't it, Michael? It's been changed. Showing my age here, showing how quickly things have changed in British politics over the last several years. It's not the biggest brief, but for a certain kind of Tory voter, it has been totemic because there are many, many, many Conservative voters, members, and indeed members of Parliament who would like to, in the wildest recesses of their honest internal selves and their sort of internal monologues, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and whatnot, they would like there to be no development aid. And so for Andrew Mitchell to go out there and say, actually, we should get back to 0.7%, which was something of a shibboleth around the neck of David Cameron. One of the commitments, despite austerity after 2010, was that they would adhere to development aid being 0.7% of GDP, which was initially a New Labour thing. So for Mitchell to say that is a really big statement of intent, I think, from the kind of Cameroon's centrist faction of the party, which is to say, look, we want to go back to the kind of centrist, quote unquote, sensible politics of 2010 to 2016. Of course, it wasn't that because you had austerity being dished out too. But this is Mitchell's brief. Clearly, there are massive tensions between people like that, and then the more hardcore right-wing Brexity people who've been at the forefront of Conservative Party decision making in recent years. I think if the Tories were to do that, it would just be incredibly unpopular amongst their base, particularly the new voters that went over to them in 2019. It's one of those policies which, if they were to adopt it, I just can't understand it. It's like Suella Braverman being the Home Secretary, talking about, sending people off to Rwanda and how her dream is to see that on the front page of the Daily Mail. And yet she's the Home Secretary overseeing record levels of immigration to the country. net immigration last year of more than 500,000. I've no issue with that. They do. Tories do. And yet they're overseeing political outcomes which their base get apoplectic about. And I think this would be another one. If you had a Tory government returning to development aid being 0.7% of GDP, the Mail, the Express, the Telegraph, all the Brexity right-wing outriders that go on to things like BBC Question Time, Julia Hartley-Brewer, Isabel Oakeshott, they would go crazy. They would go crazy. They would see this as another totemic reason why the Conservative Party are no longer Conservatives.